All right, so I think we're live. This is our very first episode of the Songs We Love podcast. I am John Adams. I am a theology professor and history nerd in Cap-Haitian Haiti, and I'll let my brother introduce himself.
Yeah, my name is Gabriel. I am the younger brother of said theology professor, and I'm a musician, and I work for a music licensing company in Vancouver, Washington. And yeah,
Nice.
I'm a music lover.
Nice. So for our first episode, we chose Fire and Rain by James Taylor, which I feel is appropriate for you, Gabe, because most of the year in Washington State you see rain, and lately you've been getting a lot of fire. So
Yeah, it couldn't be more perfect. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, we get mostly rain 9 months of the year, but now it's all fire. So
yeah.
it's
So
it's it's
I asked you
yeah.
earlier, like, is the sky glowing orange outside? Like, what does it look like outside for you right now?
It looks like a normal misty rainy day, but it's all smoke.
Okay.
Yeah, if the sun is really out, then yeah, we'll get kind of an orange glow. But at least we don't have any fire tornadoes like they have in California. We don't want any of those.
I didn't even know those existed. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Fire tornadoes.
Oh
Jeez.
yeah.
What will they think of next? Uh, and 2020 isn't even over yet, so there's
You
there's still like
know,
3 more months of it to go.
Trump's got something up his sleeve, I'm sure. So can't wait.
Never know what's going to happen. All right, so Fire and Rain is kind of an appropriate song to start off with, given how this year has gone. It came out in 1970, which also was a year that was pretty troubled. There was a lot going on that year. There had been political assassinations recently. There had been a lot of political turmoil. The Vietnam War was going on. There were protests against that, and so it was a song appropriate for its time, and it also feels still relevant 50 years later. I think everybody's seen Fire and Rain, and it seems like we've gotten more than our fair share this year. I don't know when you first heard this song. The first time I heard it, I think, was on the movie Remember the Titans.
Mm.
And it was like right after 9/11, and the song just kind of hit a nerve with me because it felt like a kind of the world is out of control. You know, being a teenager is complicated and everything is crazy right now, kind of song. And was that about the time you first heard it as well?
I definitely heard it because of you. I know that you were really into the song, and I don't know exactly where I heard it, but it was virtue of you.
Yeah.
You're like, it was usually that's how it went. I mean, you were like, this is a cool song, listen.
Yeah.
And I shared most of your musical taste, so I liked it a lot too. I remember being at summer camp, and I didn't know how to play the intro on guitar. I don't think I was that skilled yet. But there was a guy who walked around with a guitar around his neck like Bob Dylan, and I think he
I remember
looked
that
like
guy.
a young, yeah. This was in Beaufort, right? Do you remember that?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and he could play the intro, and I remember being like, "Oh, cool! Like that's how you play it." And I asked him to play it, and he showed me the fingering, and so I remember having heard it by then, which we were pretty young at that time, right? Um, so yeah, I don't know remember exactly, but I do remember hearing it from you.
Cool. Yeah, so I still don't know if I can play that song exactly the right way, but I've heard you play it before, and like I think you've got it pretty good. Um,
Yeah.
it's interesting song, beautiful song. I can't listen to it. Like it sounds honestly like it has to be a machine. Like the finger picking is so precise that it doesn't sound like it could actually be a human being. But I don't think they could even make machines finger pick songs back then. So I think it's real.
Well, James Taylor is the flying machine, so
Right.
yeah, yeah, it's to me it's not like a machine because it's kind of unpredictable. The hammer-ons are like not right on the beat all the time, and when I try to copy it, I feel like I'm always like a little bit behind or a little bit ahead. So it's
Yeah.
definitely perfect,
Yeah, he
but
does.
yeah,
Yeah, he does change it up every now and then. He keeps it unpredictable,
yeah.
which is
It,
one of
it
the reasons
ran
it's a good song.
random, but do you remember like those guitar tab programs that would play the MIDI version of? I was
Yeah,
imagining like Fire and Rain, the MIDI version, and just how terrible that would sound with all the
yeah,
hammer-ons. So that I think that would be the machine version, but
right.
fortunately, yeah,
Yeah, good point. Yeah, James Taylor's better than a machine.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so let me give you a little context for the song and talk about a little bit of James Taylor's life and kind of what wrote it, led him to write this song. So Fire and Rain is a single off of James Taylor's second album. It's called Sweet Baby James. The album actually isn't named after him. It's named after his nephew, who was named after him. But the album came out in February of 1970, and the song is an ode to a friend that James Taylor lost to suicide, or at least that's what the first verse is about. And it was released that fall as a single, and it ended up peaking at number 3 on the U.S. charts. Turned Taylor into a superstar kind of overnight. He's had plenty of hits since then, but none of them have been quite as big as that one. It kind of hit a nerve with the public, as we said before, because of everything that was going on in the culture at the time. James Taylor himself was born in Boston in 1948. He was kind of a rich kid. His dad was originally from North Carolina. When James turned 3, they moved back to North Carolina. His dad ended up becoming the dean of the medical school at UNC. He had met James's mom, Gertrude, in Massachusetts. While he was there, she was an opera singer, so she had music in her blood, and she passed that on to all 5 of their kids. James was the second of 5. James ended up growing up in the country near Chapel Hill, but his mother didn't really care for the South. She didn't really want her kids to be too Southern, so they would go back to Martha's Vineyard in the summers and spend summers there. So as a kid, James was a pretty unhappy and sensitive kid. His father was gone for 2 years out of his childhood. He went on a naval mission to Antarctica. And by the time James entered 8th grade, he was being sent away to boarding school in Massachusetts. And he kind of sought consolation in different things. His family wasn't religious at all, but he actually was into religion for a while. His mother said he worried about going to hell a lot as a child. He was worried he wasn't a good person. But another thing that he sought consolation in was music. Music probably became his main consolation as he grew older. He actually played cello, was his first instrument. And then when he was 12, he picked up a guitar for the first time and actually taught himself to play by playing songs in a church hymnal. And Taylor moved away from home to go to boarding school. He was kind of expected to be an academic like his father had been. He was on track. He wanted to become a scientist for a while, and he started applying to colleges like Harvard, but he was just completely unmotivated as a student. And meanwhile, back home, his family was kind of falling apart. His dad had been an alcoholic for basically his entire life, and after he moved away, his parents finally split up because of that. That had a really negative effect on his mental health, which had already been pretty fragile. During his senior year of high school, he actually checked himself into a mental hospital, and on the recommendation of his psychiatrist, who was afraid that he was going to hurt himself. He was supposed to be there for 2 weeks. It ended up turning into 10 months, and he actually graduated high school inside the institution. They had like a school inside the hospital, and 2 of his siblings later followed him into the mental hospital. So kind of the mental illness ran in the family. He eventually snuck out of the mental hospital, moved to New York City with a friend, and started a band called the Flying Machine. And they were the house band for a nightclub for about a year, and it was kind of a big party scene, and Taylor developed a drug habit. He got addicted to heroin during that time of his life. After about a year in New York City, he felt confident enough in himself as a musician to go out on his own. He moved to London kind of on a whim. He got over there and he bought 45 minutes of studio time, and then he gave his tape to someone. It ended up in the hands of Peter Asher, who was the talent scout for the Beatles' new record label, Apple Records. And Asher loved what he heard, and he passed the tape on to Paul McCartney, who also thought that James Taylor was kind of a genius, and he said, go find that kid and sign him to a record contract. So they signed him to a 3-year contract, and Paul McCartney was actually such a fan of Taylor that he ended up playing bass on Carolina in My Mind. George Harrison borrowed one of Taylor's lyrics, Something in the Way She Moves, and used it in his own song, Something, which appears on Abbey Road. Taylor got to sit in on sessions while the Beatles were recording the White Album, while he was recording his own debut album, which is just called James Taylor, for the Beatles album record label. But shortly after he finished recording the album, he found out that a friend of his, Suzanne Schnurr, had committed suicide a couple of months earlier, and no one had told him because they didn't want to mess up his big shot at making a hit album. Unfortunately, after his album came out, it flopped. Like nobody liked it. Critics thought it was overproduced. It didn't sell well at all, which kind of added to Taylor's mental issues. He ended up moving back to the States, lived in New York City for a while, and his drug habit became a lot stronger. And so finally he checked himself into a hospital and then ended up transferring to a mental hospital called Austin Riggs in Massachusetts. And he spent the entire winter there trying to recover from his drug addiction. And so while he was in the mental hospital, he wrote a lot of the songs that actually appear on the Sweet Baby James album, including Fire and Rain. And so the song has 3 verses, and each one of them talks about a different adversity that James had faced in his life up to then. And he was really young. He was only 21. But the song kind of sounds like a much older man's song. So the first verse, just yesterday morning, they let me know you were gone. Suzanne, the plans they made put an end to you, talks about his friend's suicide. Then the second verse, which says, won't you look down upon me, Jesus? You got to help me make a stand. You just got to see me through another day. My body's aching and my time is at hand. I won't make it any other way, is a reference to the time he spent in New York fighting the heroin addiction and how bad it made him feel. And then the third verse refers to his time in Massachusetts in the mental hospital, which talks about, when the cold wind blows, it'll turn your head around, which is talking about walking around the grounds near the hospital during the winter. And a lot of people thought that the line, sweet dreams and flying machines and pieces on the ground, in that third verse referred to some kind of tragic accident that Taylor, maybe his girlfriend, had undergone. They thought she'd gotten into a plane crash or something. But that line is actually referring to Taylor's broken dream of having a hit album on the Beatles album label, and then the Flying Machine is a record reference to his first band, which also flopped in New York City. So by the summer of 1969, Taylor was feeling well enough to start touring again. He played the Newport Folk Festival. He met Joni Mitchell. They started dating. It looked like things were going okay. And then he got into a huge motorcycle accident on Martha's Vineyard. He actually broke both of his hands and one of his feet. And he hit 4 different trees in the motorcycle accident. And they didn't know if he was going to be able to recover quickly enough to record his second album. But by the winter, he was doing okay. And so when he's playing all those complex finger picking patterns, he's actually playing with hands that were recently broken, which is kind of an interesting fact. Mm-hmm. But he signed a new record contract with Warner Brothers and recorded Sweet Baby James. It took him 3 days to finish the album because the guys had rehearsed it so well. It only cost him $7,000 to record. Since it's come out, they've sold about 3 million copies. So I'm pretty sure that's the best $7,000 they ever spent. Mm-hmm. The song Fire and Rain made Taylor a superstar overnight. In the U.S., the song kind of hit a nerve with people who were weary with a decade of political turmoil over civil rights, riots, assassinations. In the year 1970, 4 students had been killed at Kent State University in Ohio by the National Guard, who fired into the crowd during a student protest against the war. The year 1970 also saw high-profile deaths of rock musicians like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison. All of those were drug-related. And so in a world that kind of felt like it was spinning out of control, I think Taylor's song kind of fit the mood of the time, and it marked a turn in the culture away from kind of loud political music towards kind of a quieter, more introspective kind of sound. And that was a trend that continued through the 1970s. There were a lot of singer-songwriters that succeeded in that decade, like Elton John, Cat Stevens, Joni Mitchell, Carly Simon, and a lot of those people were friends of James Taylor. Taylor actually made the cover of Time magazine in 1971. They called him the first superstar of the 70s. The headline said, "The New Rock, Bittersweet and Low." He ended up marrying another superstar, Carly Simon, in 1972. But fame was not the answer to Taylor's problems or his addiction. He actually continued to battle his addiction for another decade. And he and Simon ended up divorcing because of his addiction in 1981. And apparently it was a pretty acrimonious divorce. Like, to this day, they no longer speak to each other. And his kids that he had with Simon aren't even allowed to give his phone number to Carly. So gives you an idea of how
brutal
how things went. He's still making music today. He's been able to turn out consistent hits for 50 years. And he still plays Fire and Rain at every show because he knows that people will be upset if he doesn't.
Money back.
Yeah. So I figured I'd let you talk about the musical aspect of the song as a musician. Like, what do you think makes this song work musically? What makes it a good song, and how does it kind of fit into the larger album, Sweet Baby James?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what you shared about his personal life makes the song great because he finds this delicate balance of sharing and putting to music very painful memories, but not in a depressing way. And I think that is an art form. It's like, heroin addiction. I mean, that there's not a lot of positives to pull away from that. Um, and obviously breaking your hands as a musician, like you make a living by using your hands. And yet I don't get a sense musically or lyrically that he's really in self-pity or that he's kind of angry at the world. And so just psychologically speaking, I think that really comes across in the music. I think his personality comes across a lot too. Um, just the fact that he
Okay, so we got cut off midway by the magic of Haitian internet, but we're back. And so what makes this a good song? Like, what do you think is it about this song that still feels relevant, even though it's been 50 years since it came out?
Yeah, I think it's just the art of expressing painful memories without it coming across as depressing, which I really think is an art form because he's obviously he was inspired to write both the lyrics and the music, like you mentioned, in a mental hospital after hearing of the death, the suicide of his friend, and I mean, and yet it's not a depressing song. It's certainly a deep, profound kind of introspective piece, but it's in the key of C, and um, that's typically a pretty happy, bright key, and he's on capo 3rd fret, so it has some nice open voicings. It works great for his hammer-ons, and nothing about the music would, if it was all instrumental, you wouldn't think that it was covering such heavy subject material. And the major 7 chord that he goes to, that's kind of creates a nice color. And all the little fills and like picking techniques and the variations. I mean, he's very, I think with that as a backstory, I think it's just amazing that he pulled off writing such a warm, really like easy listening song while covering such difficult, um, you know, heartbreaking material. But I was yeah, when I think about this song, I think um, it's kind of the longing that's in the song, and I think the chords do a great way of expressing that. The voicings that he uses um, have a sense of longing, but they're also hopeful. The piano and the cello, um, create a really nice backdrop for what he's trying to convey in the song. It's definitely not overproduced. I actually haven't heard James Taylor's first album, but certainly for Sweet Baby James, it's very warm, and it just sounds like a bunch of guys in a room playing, and that's probably exactly how it was recorded. They probably all played it together.
Yeah.
He stays within the same octave, so it's interesting that his mom was an opera singer because he doesn't use hardly any vibrato. And obviously, with opera singers, they use lots of it.
Yeah.
That's why you always imagine like mirrors shattering when opera singers sing. But his voice is very straight and simple, and I mean his tone and his pitch are really great. He's a great singer, but it's not flashy. There's nothing about this song or this album that seeks to draw attention to itself. And although he became a superstar, you could tell that was not his ambition. He really, to me, it doesn't come across as him trying to make a name for himself. It's really just sharing stories, like as if, he was sitting on his rocking chair on his front porch, and he was like, hey, listen to this song I just wrote. It's
Yeah.
definitely that down to earth and that personal. So like I mentioned, he stays within one octave, so he doesn't, there's really not a whole lot of inflection, or there's not a lot of jumping around. It's just very smooth and,
Yeah.
verse to verse.
Smooth is a word that gets used a lot with James Taylor, and he's actually commented on his own style. He says sometimes he gets criticized for being too mellow.
Yeah.
And he said, that's because I'm an addict, man. He's like, addicts just want everything to be mellow, right? Their lives are so out of control.
Right. And maybe that explains a lot of it. Maybe it's because his life was so tumultuous and so insane that musically he wanted something that was very different from, because obviously with drug addiction, I mean, there's tons of highs and lows, and yet his music, at least this song, there's not a lot of highs and lows. It kind of just stays right in the middle, right in the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Musically, I mean, as a guitar player, the intro, it just outlines the chords, it plays triads with the bass note, and it's a simple thing, but it's just, he articulates it really well, and it's very memorable. It's, it definitely is kind of the perfect intro for the song.
The song kind of has a, I don't know if you noticed this too, but it kind of has, it feels like it has an unresolved quality to it. Like it doesn't have any bridge. It's just kind of verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. And then in the studio, he actually just fades down. It like literally doesn't resolve.
Right.
That open kind of A chord or whatever that is that he plays when he says, I always thought I'd see you again.
Right.
Kind of has that open feel as well. And like it's so open that like when he plays it live, he actually invented a little outro for it that because otherwise he wouldn't be able to end the song.
Right.
So it has that feeling, like knowing the backstory of the song. It's kind of like I've seen Fire and Rain, but it's not like he's going through it now. It's like his worst days are behind him, but it's like he's trying to pick up the pieces and like, where do I go from here? Because he's 21 years old. Like he has a lot of life ahead of him.
Right.
But he's had a really hard experience up to that point, and now he's trying to figure out, where do I go from here?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and that was something I was going to mention too, like his use of sus chords, which, yeah, on a capo, it's like an A sus. Without the capo, it would be like a C chord. But yeah, he plays that open sus chord before he goes to the next verse. So after the chorus, end of chorus, into the next verse, and it does kind of set up this anticipation and, like a seeking for a resolve. It has an open, airy kind of quality to it, and it does kind of create that anticipation. And like you mentioned, because there's no bridge, I think it kind of speaks, I don't know if he intentionally did this, but it kind of speaks to the idea that, like, if you have a friend who committed suicide, there is no resolve to that. Like, you'll never be able to have that conversation.
That's a good point.
There's nothing you can't go back. You can't fix it. And, he knows as a young man that I'm never probably going to feel great about what happened, but I have to come to terms with it.
Yeah.
And
That's a good observation.
and yeah, like you said, I mean, there's it fades out. Even live, he kind of fades it out in his own way. And so it's like, yeah, but I appreciate that because he's not trying to explain it. He's not trying to come up with some sort of profound meaning. He's
Mm.
just an observer, you know. That's how I see him as a songwriter. He observes experiences and just tells them as truthfully as he can,
Hmm.
as a good writer does, without coloring it too much with opinion or some search for deeper meaning.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think like we should probably mention some of the individual performances. Obviously, Taylor gives an outstanding vocal and guitar performance on the track,
Hmm.
but the song wouldn't be a great song without the other individual performances. Carole King plays the piano. She actually has had some hits in her own right. She was a close personal friend of James Taylor's. And her piano just seems like always to come in at the exact right moment.
Yeah. Hmm.
And then you've got, I believe his name is Russ Kunkel on the drums. He originally was going to play this with sticks. It was supposed to be a little bit rockier of a song originally, but he started playing with brushes because they were rehearsing at their house and they didn't want to bother the neighbors. And so they liked that kind of softer sound so much that they made it part of the track. And the whole album kind of is focused on Taylor's voice and his guitar, and so the brushes add in really nicely. But the drums are like, I feel like the drums are an important piece of the song. Like they kind of keep the song moving,
Hmm.
and there's some great fills in there where
Yeah.
it's just really, really talented. And then the bassist is, I believe his name was Bob West or Bobby West or something like that. They called him Wild Wild West. He was actually a studio musician, but he comes in and he plays a double bass. That's actually not a cello, but
Oh, okay.
he bows a double bass in the song,
Okay.
and I think they actually recorded a double track of the bass to kind of
Hmm.
make it more full
Right.
and resonant.
Hmm.
But yeah, he was just a studio musician. They didn't have a bassist, so they had to just ask around and be like, who knows how to play bass in LA? And he
Hmm.
came in and just did a knockout job on this, and that kind of like droning bass note
Yeah.
uh, adds a lot to the song. I feel like.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the bass. Yeah, by the third verse, because he follows the chord changes, I think, for the first two verses, but the last one he just lets the root note drone, which kind of creates an interesting dynamic. Um, it's nice because it gives your ear like something new, by the third verse, and you have that kind of tension building between like, oh, the bass is not changing with the other instruments anymore. It's just holding down the
Yeah.
root, and it doesn't
Yeah.
clash at all, but it does kind of create kind of this kind of like, I don't know, stretching quality where it's like, wait a minute, you expect the bass to change, but it's not. And
Yeah.
so it's just kind of a nice little change.
Yeah.
Uh, and
I,
go ahead.
so I kind of wanted to talk about where it fits into Sweet Baby James. I just kind of assumed when I looked the album up that it would be the first track on the album because it's the strongest. And
Right.
usually people lead off with their strongest, but it's actually like right in the middle of the album. It's the first
Hmm.
track on the B side of the record.
Mm.
Um, and so it's kind of interesting. The last track on the A side is "Oh Susanna," which is a cover of a traditional song, and Taylor kind of does it in a jazzy way. But I
Hmm.
wonder if that's a nod to his friend Suzanne. It's like the
Right.
last track on the first side and the first track on the second side both reference his friend. And as we mentioned earlier, the first track on the album, Sweet Baby James, is actually about his nephew. He wrote it in his head in the car on the way to Boston to meet his baby nephew for
Mm.
the first time, who his brother named after him. And then the last song on the album is called "Sweet for 20G," and there's kind of a funny story behind that, which is actually like they call it a suite because they stitched three unfinished songs together to make it.
Mm.
And the reason they did that is the record contract stipulated that they had to have at least 10 tracks on the album, and they needed one more. And
Okay.
then it's called Sweet for 20G because they were promised a $20,000 bonus once they finished the album, and so they stuck those songs together to get their 20,000
Nice.
and finish the album up. So I thought that was funny.
That's great. Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
want to talk about how it fits in. But before that, you did mention the drums, which I do feel like the drums are an important part of the song. Um, like in between the verses, there's, like we mentioned, the sus chord, which creates some tension. But the drums are kind of that. It kind of separates the sections too, because it's like classic to me 70s drumming, and it always reminds me of Dad's drumming. Like whenever he played a fill, it sounded like a James Taylor fill, you
Yeah.
know. There was just something about it. There is something very unique about 70s drumming. So yeah, I think that's kind of a cool aspect of the song. But yeah, how does it fit in? I mean, like you mentioned, it's definitely the midway point, and I have heard the album on vinyl, and I think that is kind of the best way to listen to it.
Mm.
Um, like it's perfect for that. It's really a warm sounding album. But for me, I think it takes, because the songs up to this point are pretty. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the content's pretty happy or neutral. Um, this is more intensely personal. It takes kind of a somber, reflective, deep turn, definitely lyrically, and you can tell this is like a really close to his heart sort of thing. And it's definitely unique. Like, I mean, because I listened to the album several times, and it definitely stands out, not just as a single, but it sounds like it came from a different headspace than the rest of the album. It
Mm.
definitely feels pretty distinct among the rest. And like, yeah, there are one or two other songs where he kind of has that same, like, he uses the capo and uses those A voicings and uses that finger style that he's famous for. Um, but especially with, like you mentioned, the double bass and the drumming, it definitely is its own thing. It fits fine on the album, but it's definitely different than the rest.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, there's a few other songs on the album where he references his drug struggles, like Sunny
Mm.
Skies is kind of like an ironically upbeat song about a guy who's just
Right.
kind of lazy and doesn't know what he's doing in life.
Yeah.
And then Country Roads kind of makes an allusion to his mother doesn't understand why he would ever go that way again, which I think is talking about going back to heroin, and he's talking about walking around the mental institution in the country roads and
Mm.
battling that desire.
Mm.
But yeah, I definitely agree that Fire and Rain is its own unique headspace. It's its own thing.
Yeah.
If Fire and Rain was on the Enneagram, like where would you put it? What number do you think you would assign to this song?
Yeah, that's funny because I looked that up, and there's two numbers that I would associate it with. Type 4 is called the individualist. It's the sensitive, withdrawn type, expressive, dramatic. I mean, some of these things are just true to the Enneagram type, but not to this song. I wouldn't say it's self-absorbed or temperamental, but I would say it's sensitive. So this is a type 4, which is a lot of artists kind of, associate with the individualist. And then the other one, type 9 is a peacemaker, easygoing, self-effacing type, receptive, reassuring, agreeable. I don't know. That's the only other one on the chart that I could maybe see some qualities, maybe just because of how peaceful the song is and how it's not really making any waves. Like you always associate the type 9 on the Enneagram as like somebody who doesn't want conflict and doesn't want to stir the pot. And this song, musically at least, it doesn't seem like it's really starting. It's kind of provokes thought and conversation, but I wouldn't say it's like in your face, trying to like convince you of something or trying to, make a point. I think it's kind of just quiet and, you know, just observational. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think I would put it at a 9 for sure because he's like the song just doesn't like it just like I think I would put all his entire catalog in the 9 category because it just never makes any waves. It just feels
Yeah,
comfortable. Like even
yeah,
when he's talking about sad things, it never feels sad, you know?
right, right, right. Yeah,
Like
I mean,
he
it's
always
kind
kind
of,
of wants to have this comfortable emotional,
yeah.
level layer to it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, as far as Enneagram is concerned, like it seeks to make everyone in the room feel comfortable and at ease. It's not trying to you know draw attention to itself, and it's not trying to be seen or trying to prove a point, like I mentioned. So I would say maybe type 9 with a little bit of type 4, just because the sensitive artist is a lot of times associated with that Enneagram type.
For sure. Um, do you think this song is still relevant today? Like, what do you, if so, like, why do you think it still feels relevant? It's been 50 years since this song came out.
Yeah, that's hard to believe it's been that long. I think definitely. I think there's always a place for just great fingerstyle and people who are unique enough to be instantly recognizable, like his playing. I don't think that'll ever get old. I don't think people will ever get tired of hearing great fingerstyle, whether you're a guitar player or not. So I think on that end of the spectrum, like I feel like people are still attempting to make music like that too. I mean, people love folk music. They love the storytelling aspect. I don't think that's ever going to go away. And it's not, besides like the drumming that I mentioned earlier, there's nothing that's like a 70s cliche to me about the song. Um, so it doesn't sound it doesn't sound dated, like some records might. And I
Yeah.
think that's just because he's comfortable with who he is, and he is not trying to be anything he's not. And I think anytime an artist can be authentic, um, I think that is the one thing that keeps it from sounding too dated. Um, Obviously, on a totally different side of music, like another artist that I would consider very authentic, is Radiohead. And I think
Mm.
that's why their albums always kind of stand the test of time, because they're really, you can tell they're not trying to be somebody they're not.
Yeah.
They're not afraid of taking chances, and so I think that's respectable. And yeah, I think it's still relevant because storytelling is timeless too. Anytime somebody can communicate so much in so few words, um,
Mm.
is great. And also his ability to kind of let you experience his story for yourself, like I mentioned earlier, he's not coloring his experience too much. He's not trying to explain it away. Um, he's kind of letting you be an observer along with him, and just kind of like, here's my story. I think you might find your story within mine.
Mm.
Um, so it keeps kind of that mystery alive, and it keeps,
Mm.
it's just open enough to where you can enter your own feelings into the song, which I think is what you were mentioning at the beginning of our conversation, is the things that you were going through as a teenager. um, you were able to connect with this song on an emotional level. And obviously, like, you've never met James Taylor. You weren't even born when that song was recorded, and yet there's kind of like you know, this factor to the song that you can relate to.
For sure. Yeah. I think people will still be listening to this song in another 50 years. I think it just has that timeless quality. You can find your story in the symbols that he draws up, the fire and the rain. I mean, everybody's had fire and rain in their lives at some point, and those are just great symbols, universal symbols of trouble, in people's lives.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah, and I think
Uh,
my last note on that, I wrote this in my notes, just like, even though we don't get to change the past, he can't change the fact that his friend, committed suicide, or that he got into a drug addiction. But I think it just feels much better when a poet or a writer can put our feelings into words and put it to music. And I
yeah,
think that's really a big part of why the song works. Is it's we're all longing, because I think we all feel so many things that we don't always either have the words for or have great words for. Like, we'll try to express something and it just falls flat, or it seems like um, too self-absorbed. But when an artist can come around and take the feelings that we have and make art out of it, I think that's kind of what draws us to it in the first place.
Very true. I think that's a good note to end on. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of Songs We Love. If this is a song that you love, let us know in the comments or wherever you're watching this. And let us know what songs you love, what songs have made a difference in your life, what songs have given voice or put words to your own experiences. Hope you enjoy watching this. And Gabe, I hope you get a little less fire and a little more rain.
Amen to that. Amen.
All right. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, man.